For decades, Gary Burghoff's sudden exit from MASH left fans confused, heartbroken, and full of questions. As Radar O'Reilly, he was the gentle soul of the series, a character whose innocence and loyalty made him unforgettable. But at the height of the show's success, he walked away. No scandals, no headlines, just silence. Now, at 81, Burghoff is finally ready to explain why he left it all behind. What he reveals isn't just about Hollywood pressures or creative burnout. It's about family, personal peace, and the quiet cost of fame. After all these years, the truth is more moving than anyone imagined. Early life and artistic beginnings. Gary Burghoff's journey to television fame didn't begin with lights and cameras. It started in the quiet town of Bristol, Connecticut, where he was born in 1943. From a young age, Gary stood out, but not for the reasons most future stars do. He was born with a congenital deformity in his left hand, something he would later learn to navigate with both humility and resilience. His early life wasn't about fame, it was about expression. As a child, Gary found solace in two things: music and drawing. When his family moved to Delavan, Wisconsin, he embraced school productions, art classes, and hours spent perfecting his skills. In his teens, he discovered drumming, falling in love with the rhythm and freedom it brought. "Art made me feel whole," he once said. It was never about showing off. It was about feeling alive. By 1967, Gary had sharpened his performance chops to the point of landing a breakout role. Charlie Brown in the off-Broadway hit, "You're a Good Man, Charlie Brown." Audiences loved his quirky innocence, and casting directors took notice. He wasn't just acting, he was the character. That same year, he began performing in a jazz group called The Relatives, alongside then-unknown Linda Carter, who would later become TV's Wonder Woman. Gary didn't just act. He played music, painted wildlife, and lived the arts. But Gary wasn't chasing fame. He was chasing meaning. And that search would soon lead him to one of the most iconic roles in television history. And then came the call that changed everything. An audition that would turn Gary Burghoff into a household name, landing the role of Radar O'Reilly. When Gary was cast as Corporal Walter Radar O'Reilly in Robert Altman's 1970 film MASH, few realized just how important that moment would be for the actor and the legacy of the show. Unlike many of the roles being cast in Hollywood at the time, Radar wasn't your average soldier. He was sensitive, innocent, almost psychic. And Gary brought something raw and honest to the role. What made Gary unique is that he was the only actor from the film to carry his role into the legendary CBS television adaptation. In the series, Radar evolved. He went from being a sharp-tongued aide in the movie to a wide-eyed, almost childlike presence on the show. And that was no accident. "I wanted people to see Radar as the innocence lost in war," Gary later explained. He was the piece of home that every soldier carried with them. His performance was magnetic, so much so that he earned 6 Emmy nominations and took home the award in 1977. Audiences felt like they knew Radar. His nervous energy, his soft voice, the way he clung to a teddy bear when the world outside was falling apart. Gary's portrayal didn't just entertain, it comforted. He became the moral center of MASH, a character through whom viewers could process the horror and humanity of war. But being the heart of a hit show came at a cost, one that Gary would feel more deeply with each passing season. The demands of television stardom. Behind the smiles, laughter, and applause, the reality of television stardom weighed heavy on Gary Burghoff. MASH was a massive hit, bringing in millions of viewers each week and redefining what a sitcom could be. But while the world was falling in love with Radar, Gary was quietly burning out. The schedule was grueling, long hours under hot lights, multiple takes, emotional scenes, the constant pressure to perform at the highest level. "People think it's glamorous," Gary once said, "but it's a grind, especially when your heart is somewhere else." That somewhere else was often with his family. As the show grew, so did Gary's sense of imbalance. Fame didn't make him feel larger than life. It made him feel smaller, more disconnected. He struggled to juggle fatherhood with 16-hour workdays. Paparazzi hounded his personal life, and privacy became a luxury he couldn't afford. And then there were the expectations. Audiences wanted Radar to be cheerful. Writers wanted consistency. Studios wanted ratings. Somewhere along the line, Gary's needs stopped mattering. "It started to feel like I was disappearing behind the character," he confessed. "And that scared me." He wasn't the only one noticing the toll. Co-stars recalled Gary being tired, withdrawn, even emotional at times, but he never let it affect his performance. He gave everything to the show, even when he had little left to give. And beneath the pressure of fame, even deeper cracks began to form. Cracks that started in his personal life. Struggles behind the scenes. Gary's on-screen persona was wholesome, steady, even sweet. But behind the scenes, his life was unraveling in ways few people knew. During his time on MASH, Gary's marriage was falling apart. Long days at the studio and the emotional weight of Radar's character made it difficult to be present at home. "I felt like I was two people," he later revealed. "Radar on set and a stranger at home." The stress of balancing both lives began to wear on him. Arguments grew more frequent. Time with his children slipped through the cracks. And emotionally, Gary was drowning. Friends and castmates remember him as someone who carried a lot of quiet pain. He didn't lash out. He just grew more distant. It wasn't just his family life. Gary also began to experience a deep spiritual restlessness. He started questioning whether he was living in alignment with his values. "Acting wasn't making me happy anymore," he admitted. "I needed peace, and I wasn't finding it in Hollywood." He dealt with self-doubt, unsure whether his career choices were helping or hurting his long-term happiness. Despite these struggles, Gary remained deeply professional. He never let his off-camera turmoil interfere with the quality of his work. But eventually, it all became too much. And then, one day, Gary made a decision that would shock fans and alter the course of television history. The decision to leave. In 1979, after 7 successful seasons, Gary Burghoff walked away from MASH. To fans, it seemed sudden. To those close to him, it was long overdue. "I was emotionally exhausted," he confessed years later. "And I was losing connection with the people I loved most." It wasn't a decision he made lightly. Producers tried to convince him to stay. Writers even offered to reduce his screen time to give him more space. But Gary had made up his mind. The fame, the money, the awards, none of it mattered anymore. He wanted to be a father. He wanted to be present. His departure left a massive hole in the show. Radar was more than just a character. He was the emotional anchor, and fans felt the absence deeply. The farewell episode, Goodbye Radar, aired as a 2-parter in Season 8. It was emotional, intimate, and real. Gary himself wasn't satisfied with his first take on the goodbye scene. He thought it was too dramatic, too performative, so he asked to reshoot it. "I wanted it to feel honest," he explained, "because that goodbye wasn't just for the audience, it was for me. And just like that, Gary Burghoff stepped away, not in scandal, not in shame, but in quiet courage. But leaving MASH wasn't the end of Gary's story. In fact, it was only the beginning of something far more personal. Crafting a memorable farewell. Gary Burghoff may have walked away from MASH, but he didn't leave quietly. His final episode, Goodbye Radar, wasn't just another goodbye. It was one of the most emotional send-offs in TV history. When producers asked him to come back for one last storyline, Gary hesitated. He had already made peace with his decision to leave. But in the end, he agreed, because the audience deserved a proper farewell. "I owed it to the fans," he later said, "and I owed it to Radar." The original version of the goodbye scene was heavy. Burghoff poured his heart into it, breaking down in tears on camera. But when he watched it back, something didn't sit right. It felt too theatrical, too much like acting. So he asked to reshoot it. This time, he dialed it down. No sobbing, no big emotional speech, just quiet sorrow, controlled but real. That subtle performance hit harder than any dramatic outburst. You could feel the goodbye in the stillness, and viewers across America wept with him. It was a reminder that sometimes the softest moments leave the deepest impact. Co-stars later said that filming that scene was one of the most emotional days on set. "It felt like we were really losing someone we loved," said Mike Farrell, who played B.J. Honeycutt. Gary was Radar, and Radar was the heart of the show. But even after that unforgettable farewell, Gary wasn't done with the world of MASH. There were a few more chapters to write, even if they didn't go quite as planned. Life after MASH. When Gary left MASH, many assumed he'd fade from public life, but for a while he stayed close to the spotlight, just not as brightly. He made guest appearances on shows like Match, Game, where audiences got to see a lighter, more playful side of him. He reprised Radar in a few episodes of After MASH, the short-lived spin-off. And in 1984, he even tried launching his own spin-off show called Walter, which followed Radar's new life as a police officer in St. Louis. Unfortunately, Walter never made it past the pilot. Network executives passed, and the episode aired just once. Still, Gary didn't seem too disappointed. "It wasn't meant to be," he said simply. "I had already said goodbye to Radar." He also took on a few roles in small films, including Casino, 1980, and some television movies. But with each project, it became clear. Gary wasn't chasing stardom anymore. He had tasted fame, and now he wanted something else. Something quieter. By the mid-80s, he was gradually stepping back from Hollywood. Not because he had to, but because he wanted to. He'd done what he came to do, and now it was time to do something that truly filled his spirit. And that search for fulfillment took him back to something he'd always loved: creating, not performing. Pursuing personal passions. While many actors spend their post-TV years chasing a comeback, Gary Burghoff went in the opposite direction. He embraced the life of a quiet artist. Long before MASH, Gary had a passion for painting, specifically wildlife. After stepping away from television, he picked up his brushes again. What started as a hobby quickly turned into a new career. His detailed, lifelike depictions of animals in nature gained attention, not just from fans, but from galleries and collectors. "Art was always my escape," he explained. "When I paint, I'm at peace." His wildlife paintings became so popular that he began selling them nationwide. Each piece reflected not just talent, but reverence. for animals, for the earth, for the quiet moments of life we often miss. In many ways, his paintings were the complete opposite of Hollywood. No spotlight, no applause, just focus and feeling. At the same time, Gary returned to his roots as a jazz drummer. He played in small venues, often for charity, and never for fame. Music was never about ego, he said. It was about rhythm and being in the moment. These creative outlets weren't side projects. They were Gary's way of staying connected to what mattered. They grounded him in reality, in family, and in the present. And yet, even as he painted and played music, there was another side of Gary the world hadn't seen, an inventor with ideas that stretched far beyond the canvas. Innovations and inventions. Gary Burghoff's creativity didn't stop at the arts. Away from the cameras, he was also a hands-on problem solver, and he turned that skill into a surprising second act as an inventor. One of his most notable creations was a fishing product called Chum Magic, a tackle device designed to attract fish more effectively. For Gary, this wasn't just a quirky side project. It was rooted in something personal, his love of fishing and the outdoors. "I spent more time with a rod and reel than I ever did on a red carpet," he joked. But that wasn't all. He also designed practical, everyday gadgets, like a toilet seat lifting handle aimed at improving hygiene. These weren't glamorous inventions, but they were thoughtful, useful, real solutions to real problems. His inventive streak was just another example of how Gary's mind never stopped working. He didn't need a camera or an audience to be creative. He just needed curiosity. Patent filings, product demos, local trade shows. He leaned into this new chapter with the same dedication he once brought to MASH, and it gave him a quiet kind of joy. No critics, no scripts, just the satisfaction of building something useful. But even as he kept creating, there was one part of his past he could never fully shake, the character who made him famous, and the complicated legacy that came with him. Reflections on fame and identity. Even years after leaving MASH, Gary Burghoff couldn't escape Radar O'Reilly. Fans still approached him on the street, often calling him by the character's name. They didn't mean harm, but for Gary, it brought mixed feelings. "I was proud of Radar," he admitted, "but for a long time, I wasn't sure where Gary ended and Radar began." That confusion ran deep. He'd been seen by millions as the sweet, innocent clerk who could hear helicopters before anyone else. But in real life, Gary was more complex. A father, a painter, a drummer, a thinker. And sometimes, it felt like none of that mattered next to the uniform and the teddy bear. For a while, he distanced himself from the show, not out of anger, but out of a need to reclaim his identity. Fame, he said, was like a shadow that stretches across everything, unless you learn how to step out of it. Eventually, he made peace with Radar, with the show, with the memories. People who still loved him for a role he played decades earlier. "I came to understand that Radar wasn't holding me back," he said. "He was part of me, a good part." That acceptance didn't come overnight, but it came, and with it, a calmness that only time and reflection can bring. And it was that sense of peace that finally allowed Gary to embrace the most important role of his life, being a father and a man of his own making. Personal growth and family life. After leaving MASH, Gary Burghoff stepped into a world most Hollywood actors rarely experience: genuine privacy. For the first time in years, he had space to simply be a father, not a television star. He'd missed out on so many milestones while working 12-hour days on set, and that regret weighed on him. "I didn't want to just be the guy who showed up with gifts," he once said. "I wanted to show up, period." That change in mindset pushed him to prioritize time with his kids, being there for the small, everyday things. School events, bedtime stories, quiet dinners. Things fame had once taken. Gary's family life wasn't without its challenges. His marriage ended in divorce, and co-parenting came with its own complications. But even through those ups and downs, he never stopped showing up. He'd learned the hard way that success on screen meant very little if your own household intact. Friends say he became a more grounded man after MASH. Less anxious, less performative. "He was always kind," one family member recalled. But after the show, he was calm. He wasn't rushing to be everywhere all at once anymore. He spent more time in nature, walking, fishing, painting, and in those quiet moments, he found clarity. "I thought the show was my big story," Gary said years later. "Turns out, real life was." And yet, no matter how far he stepped away from the spotlight, Gary couldn't escape the love people still had for MASH. Eventually, he would meet that love with gratitude, and his fans with open arms. Reconnecting with fans and legacy. For a long time, Gary Burghoff avoided the spotlight, even when fans begged him to come back. But in later years, something shifted. As nostalgia for MASH grew, so did Gary's comfort with his past. He began attending conventions, doing occasional interviews, and participating in retrospectives about the show. What surprised him most wasn't how much people still remembered. It was how much they still cared. Fans would tell him how Radar made them feel safe, or how his innocence brought warmth to a war show. Many said his character reminded them of a lost friend or family member. "I didn't know how much that character meant to people until years later," Gary admitted. "That's when I realized this wasn't just a TV show, it was part of people's lives." He also used these opportunities to speak honestly about his exit. There was no dramatic fallout, no scandal, just burnout, personal pain, and the need to start over. And that honesty only deepened fans' respect. His appearances helped introduce Radar to a new generation, thanks to streaming and DVD box sets. Suddenly, young fans were discovering MASH for the first time and falling in love with the same character all over again. But as Gary reconnected with the world, he also had to manage something more personal: his health. And that journey brought its own lessons about strength, acceptance, and resilience. Health and well-being. Gary Burghoff never wanted sympathy, even when life gave him reason to ask for it. From the beginning of his career, he quietly managed a congenital deformity in his left hand. On MASH, clever camera angles, props, and script choices helped hide it. But behind the scenes, it was a real challenge. He never let it define him. In fact, he refused to let it be an excuse. "It's just a hand," he once said. "It's not who I am." But as he aged, other health issues emerged. Joint pain, fatigue, and mobility struggles slowed him down. Still, Gary maintained a quiet dignity. He didn't seek headlines or sympathy. He simply adjusted. He took care of his body, spent time in nature, and kept his mind sharp through painting and writing. Friends say he had a daily routine of meditation, sketching, and light exercise. Simple rituals that gave him peace. He believed in self-care before it became a buzzword. one family member joked. Even when he faced surgeries and medical setbacks, he leaned into gratitude. "Every day is a gift," he told a friend, "even the ones that hurt a little." And while his body slowed, his creativity never did. In fact, his later years would bring some of the most heartfelt recognition for the art he'd been quietly making all along. Artistic recognition and achievements. Extended. In the years after Hollywood faded into the background, Gary Burghoff's name began surfacing in an unexpected but deeply personal space: the world of fine art. For most of his life, painting had been a quiet retreat, a hobby he pursued in the solitude of his home or in the stillness of nature. But over time, those quiet sketches and watercolor studies began speaking louder than anyone expected. What started as simple wildlife illustrations turned into full-scale, emotionally rich portraits of animals in their natural environments. Foxes nestled in snow, owls perched in twilight, deer caught mid-step in the forest mist. These weren't just paintings, they were expressions of Gary's spirit. One gallery owner put it best: he doesn't just paint animals, he captures their souls. Gary's work wasn't only admired for its beauty, it had purpose. He donated many of his paintings to fundraising auctions for wildlife rescue and habitat protection efforts. He supported animal sanctuaries, local shelters, and even educational programs that introduced children to environmental awareness. "If my work can help something live longer or suffer less, then it's done more than I ever expected," Gary once said. Eventually, his art was displayed in respected galleries across the country, from small-town exhibitions to urban art fairs. Collectors and critics alike began to recognize him not just as the guy from MASH, but as a true visual storyteller. Some pieces sold for thousands of dollars, while others he gave away quietly to causes he believed in. His painting of a red fox curled beneath pine branches became one of his signature works, purchased by a wildlife foundation for permanent display. He also developed a dedicated fan base of fellow artists and nature lovers. Many were surprised to discover his acting background. "I didn't even know he was radar," one buyer said. "To me, he's just this incredible artist who sees animals with such empathy." Even as his artistic reputation grew, Gary remained grounded. He refused to use fame as a selling point. No flashy openings, no celebrity endorsements, just brush, canvas, and the honesty of nature. "I'm not painting for applause," he once said. "I'm painting because it helps me understand the world." His studio, nestled near the woods of California, became a sacred space where he'd spend hours alone, listening to bird calls, studying the movement of animals, and translating it all to canvas. In those moments, Gary found what he had been searching for when he left Hollywood: stillness, clarity, and the freedom to create without compromise. His art became his voice long after Radar's final scene faded to black. It wasn't just a second career, it was a deeper part of who he had always been. "Acting gave me a platform," he said, "but painting gave me peace." But even with art shows, fan letters, and family nearby, there was one final piece of Gary's story he had to tell. One last, quiet truth that explained why he truly walked away and what he found on the other side. Enduring impact and final thoughts. At 81, Gary Burghoff finally said what he'd held back for decades. He didn't leave MASH because of conflict or fame fatigue alone. He left because he needed to find Gary again, beneath the costume, beneath the applause. "I was proud of Radar," he said in a recent interview, "but I was losing myself in him. And if I didn't step away, I don't know who I would have become. His decision, once seen as a mystery, now feels like a profound act of self-respect. It wasn't quitting. It was choosing a life that matched his values. A life with room for silence, nature, love, and truth. Gary's story isn't about walking away from success. It's about walking toward purpose. Today, his legacy lives on through the stories he told, the lives he touched, and the art he left behind. Fans may remember him as Radar, but those who've followed his full journey know better. He was never just the innocent clerk in a war zone. He was an artist, a father, a quiet force. And in the end, he proved something rare in show business. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is leave at the right time.